All right. Welcome, everyone, to PATIO Symposium. Of course, as many of you who visit us on a monthly basis know that PATIO runs monthly sessions for conversations between academics from around the Indian Ocean region. And today is our first sort of hybrid version symposium, which we are very excited about. And we've invited a lot of guests from around the world who are looking at this very important topic of solidarity in architecture. And with the focus of PATIO being on the Indian Ocean Rim, we are particularly focusing on solidarities in the Indian Ocean Rim. So that's the basic setup for today's session. We've got three parts to the symposium. The first session is a roundtable, which will be run by Ipek Türeli and Anoma Pieris, looking at architectures of solidarity. After which we have a really short break and a second roundtable session run by Peter Scriver and Vladimir Kulic, looking at constructing South-South cooperation. After which we have yet another short break and then a public lecture, which we'll deliver here to the audience at CEPT University, which is where we are located right now in Ahmedabad in India. And hopefully many people who are online, that will be a pretty long session, but if some of you can hang on with us for that long, we'll be more than happy to have you along. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Anoma and Ipek, who are running the first roundtable session. Thank you. Anoma and Ipek, please take over.
Ipek, I'm going to share the screen.
Thank you. We thank the PATIO organizers and thanks specifically to Amit and Peter for inviting us into this conversation on architectures of solidarity. I speak from the unceded territories of the Kenyangahaka and the Anishinaabe nations and from Jehjage, which is today called Montreal. I acknowledge that colonial violence continues to shape these lands today, and I also acknowledge that such acknowledgements matter only when they remind us that solidarity must extend beyond symbolism toward reparations.
And I speak from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples in Nam. By acknowledging violent pasts that have dispossessed First Nations groups, we express solidarity with their pursuit of justice and our commitment to recognizing their grievances.
Solidarity used to be the focus of scholarly attention in social science disciplines such as sociology, political science, and political philosophy. Across these disciplines, solidarity was framed largely as an interpersonal or collective disposition. It was rarely considered to have a material or spatial dimension. In the last decade, however, a growing body of scholarship and practice has shifted this conversation, and solidarity has become an architectural question. Our discipline, architectural history, has long examined how built environments reflect power, identity, and social relations. Yet recent global movements for racial, environmental, and social justice, struggles for the decolonization of public spaces, and renewed organizing around labor, precarity, and collective rights reveal that architecture does more. It mediates collective alliances and ethical commitments. Solidarity is expressed not only through political discourse, but also through spatial practices. In this sense, architecture is not merely a witness to social change. It's a medium through which solidarities are articulated and alternative futures can be imagined, negotiated, and built. Our discipline, with its long-standing attention to the social and political histories of architecture, cities, and landscapes, is increasingly confronting issues of democracy and social justice. Thus, we are interested in examining the spatial, material, or historical conditions in which solidarity emerges. What forms do architectures of solidarity take, and when do they emerge? In addition, beyond researching and writing about such conditions, how do architectural historians enact or express solidarity in practice? Is it through their methods, collaborations, interpretive choices, or engagement with the communities they study? Thus, this roundtable expands on a double session for both academics and graduate students that was held at the Society of Architectural Historians conference in Atlanta last year in the United States. And we find the topic incredibly timely, responding initially to the many organic social movements that have transformed urban spaces and lives in the recent past and in the present globally, including South Asia and now today in Iran.
So the 5 questions that we wanted to explore was around solidarity rather than protest. I feel that the intellectual shift is important because it looks at mutual support and reciprocity in the face of adversity. We were conscious that this can happen at different social scales, which the built environment captures and shapes. Presenters were asked the following questions. How are you framing solidarity in terms of theory, methods, discipline? How are you spatializing solidarity in terms of scale, materiality, placemaking, social spatial practices, processes? Agency or positionality of the subjects and the scholar. What is the difference between framing your topic through solidarity rather than activism? What methods did you use and why? This theme will be announced for a special issue of the journal Fabrications, the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, Australia and New Zealand. The deadline for full papers is on August 21st, 2026, and the publication is scheduled for June 2027. The link is there in the bottom of the slide, but I'll put it in the chat as soon as I finish speaking. We are looking for papers that examine the role of public places and buildings in galvanizing and sustaining civic actions by minority groups and countercultures at both local and global scales, ranging from the defense of civil liberties, environmental activism, anti-colonial and anti-war demonstrations to Occupy movements. We hope that they might extend the historical analysis of these larger mobilizations to more recent challenges to neoliberal expansion, political hegemony, and forms of land, resource, and labor exploitation. These contemporary movements seek redress and reparations for the various forms of social and economic discrimination experienced by minoritized groups. We were also interested in the temporary appropriation and transformation of urban public spaces for these agendas. Such a focus would highlight ephemeral elements and physical architectures of solidarity, such as barricades, encampments, public utilities, temporary housing, community spaces and gardens, signage, monuments and artworks, and also the virtual presence that sustain their politics beyond the temporal limits of a specific event. Basically, we are looking for precedent-setting scholarship that empowers forms of social engagement and cultures of urban activism that foregrounds minority agendas. So my own particular interest in this topic came out of participating in the 2022 Arièle People's Sovereignty Movement in Colombo, Sri Lanka. That movement was more about empowerment than opposition, in my view. I studied the urban encampment, which for a short period of around 9 months, presented a challenge to the gleaming towers of the neoliberal city. I walked in a rally from the Independence Square in Colombo's residential and civic center to the central business district with like-minded friends. The situation in Sri Lanka was caused by the government's fiscal mismanagement and corruption. The encampment took on the name of a village, Gota Go Gama, Gotabe Go Village in Sinhalese, asking for the president Gotabe Rajapaksa to step down. As part of my research, I asked a fellow architect to document incremental changes in the encampment, which he mapped, and I hope to reproduce these graphically to demonstrate how civic functions absent in the city were being reproduced in the village. Temporary tents and structures were identified as Red Cross clinics, library, university, theater, art gallery, kitchen, washrooms, memorial, for example, and residents even erected signage on the encampment streets. Although violently opposed and evicted, the movement eventually succeeded in ridding the country of the president and bringing down his government at the national election. I have published a chapter on this topic in a forthcoming Routledge Handbook on Urban Political Violence, on the impact of neoliberal globalization on the post-colonial city.
Thank you. I'll also say a few words about my interest in the topic. My thinking about how architecture engages social movements began years ago during the Occupy movement, the Arab uprisings, and the Gezi protests. That work eventually led to my 2013 special issue on civil protests and urban design in the International Journal of Islamic Architecture. But what has happened since the ongoing genocide in Gaza, the fate of the Solidarity encampments within our own institutions in North America, and a renewed reckoning with our discipline's responsibilities and complicity pushes us further. It brings us to what we are now calling architectures of solidarity. After November 2023, many of us expected our professional associations to speak publicly about Palestine, just as they had spoken during Black Lives Matter or after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I was, in fact, on the board, a board member of the Society of Architectural Historians, and I couldn't, along with a couple of colleagues, I couldn't affect any change on this topic. So when the society remained silent, some of us organized on our own. In December 2023, we drafted the petition, Palestinian Liberation is Our Collective Liberation. It was titled as such, and hundreds signed it. And we sign petitions every day. But what happened with this particular one is that the New York Times linked to it in a story about a targeted PhD student at Columbia University. And the signatories, our dissent list became a target list. The signatories were suddenly, all architectural historians, they were suddenly put at risk, and we removed the list for their safety. That experience, the writing, the conversations, the care, made an SAH, Society of Architectural Historians session on architectures of solidarity feel not just relevant, but necessary. And I was lucky to collaborate with Anoma on this session. We wanted to ask how solidarity shapes scholarship, whether we write about spatial solidarities, whether our writing generates solidarity with our subjects, or how spatial conditions themselves cultivate solidaristic relations. And of course, it didn't stop there. Campus events the following summer made these questions even more urgent. At my own university, the Palestine Solidarity Encampment and a faculty unionization drive were both met with institutional lawfare. I learned so many new terms through this process. Yet, this kind of institutional lawfare produced new unexpected alliances. The 75-day encampment transformed the campus into a people's university built from the scraps of the institution, from collective care, from critique, and it became a living example of what La Pepperson calls the third university, a space where solidarities don't just respond to political conditions, but actively create new spatial and political possibilities. So we are interested in this roundtable and beyond investigating solidarity in our scholarship. We suggest diverse ways in which to conceptualize solidarity. Maybe we could switch to the next slide. That would be great. Yes. solidarity, we are interested in solidarity that develops among individuals who share fundamental values such as religion or human rights. Solidarity as arising from sharing common material interests, such as that among workers or co-workers or laborers, from rational choice, for example, individuals coming together in order to pursue common ends, or solidarity that arises from positive social energy generated in the course of ritual interaction, solidarity that emerges from emotional energy, solidarity as an intersubjective state.
So we're also interested in solidarity that emerges as a framing different from, but sometimes incorporating protest. Solidarity that is conceptualized through related terms such as generosity, reciprocity, implication, empathy, respect, affect, communal world-making, radical interdependence, that don't always align. Solidarity that is sought by minoritized groups in majoritarian democracies or political systems with democratic aspirations, who often need coalitions beyond strategically essentialized identity politics in order to be heard. So now I'm just going to move to the list of speakers. And we are excited to share today 3 different approaches to this topic because one of our speakers is unable to be here. Each speaker will present for 8 minutes and we will discuss at the end of the presentations. We have first Anna Goodman from Portland State University, who's going to speak on resistance, occupation, and public space in Seattle, 1971 to 2020. And then we have Arièle Krosnick from McGill University, who is going to speak on The Fire Hydrants Were Turned On Again, Chicago, 1966. And then we have Dhara Patel from the Technische Universität Darmstadt, who's going to speak on minor architectures of endurance. And I want to thank the speakers because they are all staying up very late in order to be with us today. Thank you. So please start, Anna. And I will stop sharing.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. Let me share my screen, and then I will begin. Does it look good on your side? So I have shifted a little bit from the topic that Anoma presented, and which I presented at the essay conference in Atlanta last year. I've been working a lot this year on completing a book project on the concept of the citizen architect. And my head, being in the United States and in Portland, Oregon, which is one of the centers of the North American or United States protest movement at this time, I've been struggling a lot trying to think about what the meaning of solidarity is within the context that I'm occupying right now. You know, participating in protest or solidarity movements in the United States is a different question, I think, than some of the ones that are going to be explored in other sessions. So I wanted to introduce you a little bit to that context and to my greater work before I talk a little bit about the solidarity research that I'm doing for the edited collection that Ipek and Anoma are editing. Okay. So in general, the 3 main centers of my research and my interest in architectural history are in looking at education as a means to facilitate participation and active citizenship, to think about labor within an interclass, ethnic, and a national context, and to think about storytelling, iconography, publication as methods of identity claims. And those are the types of things that are produced by the public or by architects or by architectural historians. So I'm going to talk about two different sites today, and I've been thinking a lot about the political scientist Jodi Dean and her discussions of solidarity and of identity as a location and a site from which the world is viewed. So if you think about the two very brief cases that I'm going to talk about today as different sites of identity formation, I'm hoping that they can shed a little bit of light on what I consider some of the limitations of architecture and architectural education in particular as a means of accessing solidarity discussions and deep and meaningful solidarity. So these are two different historical cases that I'm going to talk about. They both take place in the exact same year. And I'm going to start on the eastern coast of the United States in Vermont. So this is a story about a university called Goddard College, whose founders were interested in organizing their students around the idea of generating citizens who could engage with a new type of social order, a post-war social order that would be organized around freedom, around democracy, around self-direction, and the idea of social reconstruction. So it was an idea that students should learn in the way that the world should be modeled in a self-constructive way. And in this, there entered in the 1970s, in 1971, a pair of architectural educators who offered to set up a program in which students could actually manifest their interest in self-definitions, in creating ideal communities by building their own campus on the site of this sort of idyllic Vermont setting. And so in the context of the 1970s in the United States, there was this sort of proliferation of anti-war, of anti-globalization movements, of back to the land movements, and an idea that if you could work together in groups towards anti-imperial efforts, towards the project of sort of commodifying your life and the environment around you, there would be, as a result, a sort of what Michael Zhao calls fate sharing, or solidarities that are made through the sort of collective action of making a world together. And this is a kind of architectural education that is still pursued today in the United States in some areas, and which is seen as sort of representative of a solidarity-oriented architecture. And so I started thinking about the limitations of this model when I kind of participating in and reflecting on some of the occupation movements that Ipek mentioned at the beginning of the discussion. I learned about another education endeavor that was happening on the other side of the country in Seattle, Washington. In the exact same year, so in 1970 to 1975. So this is just after the major student movements in the United States, just after the environmental movement and the free speech movements started to really blossom. So in a very different educational context, a series of Chicano activists in Seattle, Washington, took over an abandoned elementary school and started to reshape and refashion the walls and spaces of the building to be Seattle's first Chicano community center. And during a 45-day occupation, they used iconography, they used improvisational methods, not so unlike the ones used in this sort of Goddard project or another sort of architectural improvisational exercise, but with sort of reinscribing this existing building, they turned it into the type of model community that they wanted to exist in Seattle. And after after the occupation was successfully completed, the organizers who had put together a coalition across many different sort of ethnic lines, including indigenous activists, Black nationalists, and Chicano and Asian American activists, began the process of thinking really deeply about how to take a sort of a standard education institution and transform it into something that could reflect a solidarity that spanned across the Pacific Rim, which is sort of another global connectivity network that parallels the one that you're talking about in your sessions today. And so this is an unbelievably brief and maybe strange pairing, and you can probably see a little bit the way I'm struggling to grapple with some of the causes of solidarity and my own positionality right now. And to really think, if reflective solidarity is a way of thinking about the complex webs of interconnections within which we are all individuated, meaning, solidarity is a way to form groups, to form connections, and to also have connections across groups that don't necessarily share in all of their interests. I wonder a lot about how our institutions, especially our education institutions and architecture, sort of divert the energy that can go into solidarity movements and making towards things that create the type of solidarity that is more limited and which actually kind of gives a veil of solidarity in the face of true challenges. Thank you.
Thank you. That was amazing. You'll take some questions, right, Anna?
Yes, happy to, of course.
Yes. I mean, we allocate time after each presentation. We will be able to take a few questions before we we engage in collective discussion. Anna, you talked about a lot. I mean, you kind of brought a lot of things together. Maybe you could you alluded at the end to our contemporary institutions. What's the term you used? Deflecting this kind of energy. Maybe you could talk about that, because the scholarship, what we study as historians is of course framed by our current dilemmas, and it would be interesting to hear more about what you're experiencing and how it makes you reflect on these historical cases.
So in preparation of this paper, there was just a very recent new edition of the Journal of Architectural Education, which is a journal reflecting all architecture schools and scholarship in the United States, on civic architectures. And it was extremely fascinating to me to sit down and try to process this issue, because there was a huge controversy, of which you may be aware, Ipek, of last year, in which there was meant to be, this same journal was meant to have a special issue on Palestinian liberation. And because of pressure from the national government and state governors into some of the board of the journal, they actually canceled the journal, even though it had been completely peer reviewed, everything had been done with the journal, and it was a huge controversy. And my university, Portland State, was the only university and a few universities in Canada that actually withdrew from the organization that sponsored the journal in protest, of this what we considered infringement on academic freedom, and also a sort of a proactive compliance with sort of a fascist agenda of closing dissent on certain topics. And so this journal was then taken on, and now it's been published very quickly. They came with a new issue, and the issue was on civic architectures. And I thought it was so interesting, this idea of civicness as a sort of there's all these different discussions of what it means to be a good architect, to collaborate with government, to forward the common good. And one of the things that they mentioned in there is a topic which is very deep in my research, which is design build education, and saying this was one of the best ways that architects could really show how civic they were and what good citizens they were. And I thought it was so strange. And I'm just really feeling emotional and grappling with how the profession has attempted to remain sort of a beacon of liberal thinking and contribution, and at the same time, not yet grapple with this major, yeah. So,
Mhm. Well, now
sorry.
that you've opened the Pandora's box, when we had a lot of discussions in our institutions in Canada, as you know, Canadian institutions also contribute. And even without the cancellation or censorship of the special issue on Palestine, the question I had was, this is an American journal, American institution, ACSA. Why are we contributing to a country that's threatening, or the institutions of a country that's threatening to invade us? And we had the strangest conversations within our unit, and I think all Canadian schools had these discussions. And bravo to your unit for withdrawing, because I understand the urge among architects and architectural educators to conform.
So I'd like to ask a question as well. So I'm interested in the idea that, so we have particular kinds of solidarity movements that are mobile and occupy space temporarily during a particular temporal window of time. And then we have occupy movements that occupy buildings, or, like I described, create encampments, create permanent places. And what do you understand about that mobilization of materiality in order to advance a cause? Do you have any ideas in relation to your the ideas of citizenship that you were trying to foreground?
I think, as you said, historically, this idea of like the encampment in different locations. I mean, to me, I'm most familiar with student encampments or adjacent to university campuses, and the sort of flow that happens between like sort of like intellectual dialogues and these encampments, and how different kinds of people, discussions can come together. I don't know. I'm not being very clear, but I think I would say the one thing that really comes to mind is I was thinking recently about the idea of education for nationalism, or education for particular types of very like rigid identities. And And I think that these types of encampments have a way of unmaking those or remaking them in a new way because of the types of identifications that happen on the street or that happen in the encampments. And so I think the El Centro de la Raza and there's several cases in Seattle that are actually similar that I encourage people to look into, where there is almost something that would have been sort of like a street or a public type of occupation moves into a building. And then because of the specific geopolitical positioning of that place at that exact historical moment, it becomes allowed and then it becomes like calcified and it stays there. And it starts to become a very productive and extremely interesting and useful thing for immigrant communities, but for all communities in the city to gain resources, to advocate for social supports, to understand and navigate legal systems that were previously not available. So I think, and I do not think I conveyed this in the paper, but this is what my brain was thinking, was that on the one hand, in El Centro de Raza, the building itself creates this way to accumulate different kinds of solidarity and to be very flexible and offer lots of different types of supports for solidarity building as a movement. And on the other hand, the university, or this very sort of improvisational, self-fulfilling thing that's extremely nice for architects to be building and to be making like their own encampments in some ways to their building their world is very rigid and very poor in offering those same types of solidarity opportunities. It's almost like the same type of solidarity, which is the interpersonal, inscribed at large, versus the other is like all these different types of solidarity that layer on top of each other.
Thank you. I guess we should move on, isn't it, Ipek? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anna. And we'll move on to Arièle. Arièle, if you can, share your screen. Thank you.
Hi, good morning to those present at the conference, and good evening for those of us elsewhere in the world. Thank you for the invitation. I will just share my slides. And begin. So my dissertation, Swimming Pools, Civil Rights in the American City in the 1960s, proposes that Black civil rights protests that took place at swimming pools, contesting unjust racial and spatial segregation, had the potential to radically transform the symbolic and physical built environment of American cities. And today's presentation is an excerpt from one chapter focused on the city of Chicago, and offers a microhistory of the 1966 West Side Riot, which took place between July 12 and July 15, 1966. So my research situates this riot as part of the expanded circumstances of urban desegregation efforts during the 1960s, and in this case, specifically in the primarily Black neighborhoods of North Lawndale, West Garfield Park, Austin, East Garfield Park, and the near West Side. And these neighborhoods really form the core of Chicago's Black West Side. So for a bit of context, during and after World War II, Black Southerners fleeing the Jim Crow South migrated to Chicago in search of employment and opportunity. And racist real estates and lending practices segregated the new arrivals into ghettos onto the south and west sides of the city. And the west side has been called by historian Arnold Hirsch the second ghetto, and it was newer and poorer than the south side ghetto. So in 1966, Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. moved into an apartment on the west side to call attention to these poor conditions, and he announced the plans for the Chicago Freedom Movement, which was the first campaign expanding civil rights activities to the northern cities. And his National Southern Christian Leadership Conference worked alongside local coordinating council of community organizations on campaigns for fair housing, targeting primarily the urban ghetto and slum conditions on the West Side. So the riot, here is my slide related to those events and the SCLC work in Chicago. So the riot, which began with children playing in the water from a fire hydrant, ended only after the civil rights leaders negotiated with the city for the construction of portable above-ground swimming pools, showing that the movement for open housing was deeply intertwined with demands for equal access to recreation spaces, such as swimming pools. So in retelling the events of the summer of 1966, the West Side is considered an active contributor to the formation of multiple and often conflicting forms of collective action, from these formal civil rights organizations who were engaged in political negotiations to nonviolent marches, but also riotous uprising. And it brings together multiple actors in this kind of contingent collaboration, from national civil rights groups to local communities, from activists and engaged residents, and also gang members who all shared and negotiated the neighborhood streets, corners, and playscapes. So on July 12, 1966, there was a heat wave in Chicago, and the segregated and under-resourced Black neighborhoods had little to no access to public swimming pools. So on the near West Side corner of Throop and Roosevelt Road, these young people were playing in the spray of the fire hydrant. Police officers arrived on the scene, and they arrested several of these young people and beat some of the Black boys. And the crowd, provoked by this brazen police brutality, began to fight back. And as the encounter escalated, the demonstrators turned their ire towards the surrounding buildings and streets, engaging in vandalizing and looting, arson, and gunfire. The events then spread from the near West Side, which is one of the neighborhoods of the West Side ghetto, into multiple other neighborhoods, and this continued over the course of multiple days. The mayor requested mobilization of the National Guard, and you can really see in these photographs the city under siege from police and National Guardsmen. So during these events, some youths looked on from porches, rooftops, and windows, and some remained bystanders. Some adult observers were saddened and angry about the destruction of the neighborhood. The other photographs of these events also show the altered state of the built environment, buildings crumbling and blackened from the smoke of fires, window fronts reduced to rubble. So the writers' actions really reconfigured the streetscape through these unsanctioned acts, but they also actively shaped space through both their presence and their visibility, their active claiming of public space. Forced to live in these slum conditions, under attack by police brutality, the masses turned their anger and desolation towards the built environment of the very ghetto that segregated and isolated them. The West Side Riot was a sudden exposure, a laying bare of untenable architectural conditions, and a revolutionary response to the violence of the state. The West Side streets became the locus of connection through which radically different groups connected and assembled. Some citizens rising in protest may have had differing and intense tactics than the nonviolent civil rights activists. All parties were standing up to power and demanding this lasting political and physical change. So, some of the actions that were happening were neighborhood meetings and organizations calling for calm. They mobilized counter-riot work, such as volunteer peace patrols. So all these different groups and actors in the neighborhood came together. Dr. King and his organization also met with some of the youth gang leaders who agreed for a time to try to adopt these nonviolent direct actions as a method. And the fact that King had moved into their neighborhood, that enabled these new forms of communication between the nonviolent movement and the gang leaders, providing an opportunity to debate, interact, and find solidarity in a temporary truce. So the mayor and the civil rights organizations basically went head to head and tried to negotiate a resolution. But the mayor blamed the civil rights organizing for riling up the protesters, while Dr. King was calling out the systemic injustices of life in the northern ghetto, both the racial and economic inequality, the decaying buildings, and also this lack of recreation. So at the end of the riot, when quiet prevailed, you can see neighborhood residents coming together to clean, sweep, and care for their West Side home. Part of this resolution to the end of the riot involved the construction of 24 portable swimming pools, and we see a photograph here of the pool at Fosco Park being installed. So in an ironic twist, backyard swimming pools, like these above-ground pools, originally proliferated in the years of suburban expansion and white flight. But in this case, the portable above-ground swimming pool became this short-term solution to the uprising on the West Side. And of course, this was insufficient. Dr. King confided in a letter how ironic it is that in Chicago, 4 days of rioting were precipitated by the shutting of water hydrants. The authorities then found $10,000 for portable pools, but meanwhile, the state was spending $100,000 per day for the National Guard. So this plan to install 24 pools fell through. Only 7 swimming pools were installed in the city, and only 4 of these in the West Side. But what I'm interested in here is how these spaces of summer recreation, both the fire hydrant and the swimming pool, really were transformed into sites of social, political, and racial contestation, and in so doing, reconfigured the city streets. The protests mobilized and brought together these different groups with different perspectives, even if only in contingent solidarity. And even though the rioters had no formal leadership, their actions were translated into formal demands by the civil rights groups in their negotiations with the city, leading to the architectural intervention that was the portable swimming pools. So on the west side of Chicago in 1966, these pools and the fire hydrant constituted, yes, a design landscape of control by the city, but also one of dissent, refusal, joy, and justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Arièle. Riot or protest, that distinction is also interesting. Because we are asking all presenters to frame your work through solidarity rather than protest. I wanted to ask where that reframing changes your reading of tactics, actors, or outcomes. What does it allow you to decenter or reveal?
Thank you for that question. Yes, I mean, the chapter at large, the framing of solidarity really came through the opportunity to participate in these panels. But I think what it helped me to clarify was in so much of the reading I've been doing about civil rights in this era and the conditions, there's really this attempt to separate, to make a very clear divide between these formal civil rights organizations with nonviolent protests and then these, the gang leaders or these unruly, violent protests like the riot. And what's been most interesting in thinking about solidarity in this particular case is how, in fact, how closely aligned their goals, their aspirations, their hopes for the city and for change in their neighborhoods. So I think, yes, I mean, I do attempt to kind of distinguish between tactics and also opportunities to even be present at the table negotiating with the city. Like this is not something that was afforded to the rioters. But how in fact they were speaking to one another. They were in collaboration. The civil rights groups were very criticized for engaging in this matter with the gang members, for example. But even some of the photographs I've shown, I didn't have time to explain in detail, but some of the photographs, if we're to believe the captions, say, oh, these are of young children sweeping the streets. These were members of the Vice Lords, one of the West Side gangs. So just how much care there really was for all of these people involved, even as riots are often framed mostly as a destructive act. It was interesting in this case to find, these common goals and some common ground between, these people fighting for better conditions in their neighborhood. Yeah.
So
Thank you.
I'd like to ask a question about the pool itself as because of the history of civil rights around pools and what it means in the US, because in Australia also there was a similar kind of occupation of the pool as from the indigenous point of view to get access. So can you tell me, it's very interesting, isn't it? First you have the whole kind of, getting access to a pool versus bringing the pool to the community. How are you thinking about the pool and access to water in this context?
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. I mean, this is a really particular case study, and my other chapters of the dissertation really start with the swimming pool and lack of access. So I'm exploring kind of these different tactics and different kinds of pools along the way. And here it's really the fact that there were no pools, and the swimming pool becomes this solution, this quote unquote solution. So that's been really interesting because kind of the contestation is really around this lack, this absence, due to the residential segregation and all these urban contexts in the U.S. in the post-war and suburbanization, which obviously I mentioned very briefly. So yeah, the portable pool is like really interesting, and I'm trying to trace also, the city. I came across some archival documents. They made a plan to build some what they called kind of spray parks, so just like concrete decks with sprayers and some neighborhood pools, which were built in-ground pools. But doing this research, the geographic locations that they chose for these more formal investments didn't exactly track on to the same neighborhood where they're saying, oh, maybe we should give you some pools because otherwise it could erupt in this way. So it's been really interesting to see how this temporary feature, this kind of prefab pool, right, that you could also buy probably to put in your backyard if you had the means, is kind of, deployed by the city as this temporary measure, but it also represents such a lack, and it continues to represent this lack of further investment. So yeah, it's been kind of really interesting to try to track where and when real swimming pools were built, and how that lack of access continued to exist. So I'm not sure I'm really answering your question, but thank you.
Thank you. We should move to Dhara now. Yeah, thanks.
Hello, I'm going to share my slides. One second. Can you see it? Okay. So I think I'll get started then. Hi, everyone. A very good morning to people in Ahmedabad, and a big hello to everyone everywhere else. I am in Germany at the moment, So my talk today examines how solidarity emerges through everyday spatial practices among Indian highly skilled migrants in Frankfurt, Germany. So rather than appearing as large collective projects or political mobilizations, solidarity here operates through small recalibration of domestic and shared architectural spaces. Sorry, I'm trying to. So this apartment is located in Eschborn on the periphery of Frankfurt am Main, within aging post-war housing blocks, yet only minutes from major corporate offices. The residents are highly skilled Indian migrants who are university-educated professionals with secondary and tertiary qualifications recruited into Germany's technology sector under skilled labor visa regimes. Many work for multinational IT firms clustered around Frankfurt's financial zone. Now, despite secure employment and above average incomes, many encounter persistent difficulty securing good quality housing in Frankfurt's stratified private rental market. Access to desirable housing stock is mediated not only by income, but by informal screening practices, landlord discretion, and subtle perceptions of risk and difference. When I arrived at this apartment, 3 men were gathered in the living room. One lived on the floor below. Another had arrived 2 weeks earlier and was still searching for housing large enough to bring his wife and 2 children from India. All 3 were employed in multinational tech firms. They were preparing mendu vada, coconut chutney, and sambar, labor-intensive dishes which are rarely cooked alone. So 3 men, 1-bedroom apartment, a temporary household assembled inside a plan which was drawn for something else. So if we read the plan architecturally, something subtle but noteworthy happens. The apartment was designed for a nuclear household. 1 kitchen, 1 bedroom, 1 living room. But in practice, the kitchen exceeds its architectural boundary. The designated cooking zone spills into the living room. The dining table becomes preparation surface. Circulation compresses as bodies gather. The kitchen is no longer a contained room. It thickens into collective infrastructure. What appears at first glance as overcrowding is, spatially speaking, a recalibration of the program. Furniture shifts function, boundaries soften. The apartment absorbs more life than it was designed to hold. When we layer additional uses onto the same ground, the transformation becomes clearer. At other moments, the couch converts into transitional shelter. Work surfaces doubles as desks. Sleeping, cooking, and salaried labor occupy overlapping territories. These uses do not replace one another, they accumulate. The architecture does not change materially, but its patterns of occupation thicken. The living room becomes simultaneously collective kitchen infrastructure, shared labor space, temporary shelter, what is often described, including within the diaspora, as voluntary clustering or cultural preference, appears here instead as adaptation under constraint. The apartment functions as a domestic shock absorber. It absorbs pressures produced elsewhere in a housing market that filters access beyond income. This is not renovation, it is transformation through occupation. Now, these spatial adjustments extend beyond the apartment interior. On Saturdays, a mobile Indian grocer arrives at the housing complex and positions the truck along the building facade. Indian grocery stores are accessible elsewhere in the Frankfurt region, so the vendor appears here not because of scarcity, but because of concentration. A critical mass of Indian highly skilled migrant households live within this aging apartment block, a clustering shaped less by preference than by uneven access to high status housing stock. So density here produces infrastructural possibility. For a few hours, the building edge recalibrates. A parking strip becomes exchange surface. The facade becomes market frontage. A residential block acquires a temporary commercial layer. Now, within Germany's tightly regulated residential environments, where shared spaces are governed by detailed rules regarding appropriate use, such recalibration requires more than demand. It requires collective tolerance. Solidarity here operates through co-presence. Through density, residents generate enough collective presence to normalize a minor infrastructural addition. What emerges is not protest, it is continuity, a familiar spatial rhythm. The street-side grocery exchange common across Indian cities becomes momentarily enactable within a German suburban housing block. Periodically, families also gather in the forecourt of the building to mark national and religious calendars. Plastic chairs appear, a flag is briefly raised, children move between parked cars, conversations extend across balconies and ground level. The ground plane, ordinarily parking and circulation, becomes briefly collective. Unlike the vendor in the previous slide, which anchored continuity at the building's edge, this moment produces visibility. In Frankfurt, there is almost negligible architectural expression of non-German cultural identity in the central urban fabric. So religious and cultural institutions serving migrant communities are often located in industrial zones, peripheral districts, or concealed within anonymous buildings. Visibility in civic space is rare. Against this backdrop, the forecourt gathering performs something subtle but significant. It is not monumentality, it is not an official event, it is minor and time-bound. But for a few hours, presence becomes perceptible. A residual threshold becomes public stage. What is enacted here is not nationalist assertion, but rather the right to practice culture without concealment. Afterwards, the chairs are removed, cars return, the surface resumes its prior function. The architecture remains unchanged, but appearance has briefly occupied the ground. So these practices emerge under the conditions of racialized housing exclusion within Frankfurt's private rental market, a disjunction between labor market inclusion and housing market marginalization. I call these minor architectures of endurance. They are small-scale spatial formations that stabilize life under exclusion, not monumental projects, not insurgent occupations, and not state-sponsored solidarities. They emerge through occupation rather than design authorship, through repetition rather than spectacle, through maintenance rather than rupture. They are frequently misrecognized, including the diaspora, as cultural preference or lack of integration. Yet what appears as clustering actually operates as adaptive infrastructure. So here solidarity is not staged as resistance. It operates through density, co-presence, and mutual accommodation. So through collective occupation of interiors, facades, and thresholds, residents recalibrate space in ways that generate comfort, continuity, and visibility without transforming the larger structure that constrains them. So I want to end the presentation with kind of a question that I myself have, that, if solidarity is recognized only in moments of monumentality or rupture, then dense repetitive spatial practices through which migrant life is stabilized remain outside the architectural archive. So how do we account for these spatial practices which barely kind of leave any formal architectural traces? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I will stop sharing.
Dhara, beautiful,
Yes.
beautiful drawings. They
Thank
are
you.
very effective, and your presentation, and a lot of my design students are interested in these kinds of, now I know how to call them, minor architectures of endurance.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask in the negative, what doesn't work, what doesn't sustain? In your studies, what kind of practices have not endured?
You mean for the residents, you mean?
Well,
Yes.
yeah. Among these minor architectures of endurance, what
Yes.
has failed to endure in your observations, in your studies? What have you observed to
I think
not endure?
so. So this solidarity, or let's say the minor solidarities that I talk about, they are also situational, so they are not universal. So if you look at this one episode, it might seem ideological or even romantic to one point, this collective endurance. But in reality, it actually creates also quite a huge exclusion within the diaspora, because as I mentioned a couple times, within the diaspora itself, from the point of view of longer established diasporic members, they see this formation as cultural preference by these people. So it is not necessarily recognized from the outside as an act of solidarity, but rather a lack of integration into the local culture and society, and voluntary clustering, which is not the case. So I think that is the biggest discrepancy that I noticed. Yeah.
Mhm.
I think also there is a sense of, it makes you think about what are the opportunities that are being denied, that are offered
Yes.
by public space and by a sense
Mhm.
of common citizenship. And
Yes.
it makes you then like think of the inverse of what you're presenting. So what is
Yeah.
it? Yeah, what is being denied, and then what is being kind
Mhm.
of struggled for in this
Yeah.
process. I think that's also very important to understand.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean,
but I think
yeah,
thinking through the visuals really makes you see it, makes you see the
yeah.
way in which that concentration happens. So it's a very powerful tool to represent it in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, because I was very interested in, how this migration condition can be read through architecture, right? So because me being an architect and interested in, space, yeah, how the spatial practices and through, architecture tells us the story. So that's why I suppose drawing is my tool as well to bring forth these observations and these practices. Yeah.
And I guess the next step is shifting from spatial appropriation to actually design elements that,
Mm-hmm.
can be adapted or used in different ways, or then provided
Yeah.
from an architect's point of view.
Yes, I mean that is something that I've been thinking as well, because especially given these very specific housing history in Germany, the post-war housing stock, it is very typically imagined for this nuclear family or even individuals, so it does not accommodate the migrant population at all. And with migration comes um, a very different kind of family configuration as well. So the layouts then need flexibility. So, if those were then adapted in design, that would then accommodate really, the migrant populations.
We have like 8 minutes left. Amit gave us another 5 because we started a bit late. So maybe we could, pose a question or two for Anoma, for all our speakers. And I had one, maybe, feel free to respond, all of you. I had one, because in Solidarity, we are talking about also a feeling. I want to ask how, the emotional atmosphere of each space that you're talking about, or cluster of space you're talking about, how that atmosphere helps amplify or dampen solidarity.
Can I add to that so that it's one
Yes.
question? So I'm also
Please.
interested in the sensorial cues, because I think there are aspects of everything you're presenting which is sensorial, which don't necessarily get conveyed through photographs, but we can see it happening. So yeah, so affective and sensorial, I think.
I wanted to say, Dhara, I wished I had done a my fuller presentation on this case in Seattle, because it was one interest of mine to take the floor plans of an existing building in some ways and really look at the intended use of it, which was a co-educational, setting, and seeing how diaspora, mostly from Latin America, but also indigenous Seattleites, and also, people from the Philippines use those spaces for different kinds of uses. And I think it's a really interesting, and to kind of point to your question around, how do we capture this kind of thing that isn't it's neither a grand protest that's going to be in the newspaper, nor is it an architectural design that's going to fit into a museum. How does that find its way into architectural history? And I do think that the atmosphere of iconography, of things like, symbols and symbolism that gets put up either temporarily or fully, a color and texture, smell, cooking, the organization of bodies around a table. Those things are really important. And I think in the US, the solidarity movements that are growing now are learning what diaspora and other people know already, which is that we need these things to form connections with other people. And that's the strata on which political action actually lays, not the other way, not top down.
Interesting.
Arièle, do you have something to say?
Yeah, I guess it's been emotional and effective and sensorial. I mean, I guess photographs definitely are such a huge part of my work because I have a background in visual culture and art history. But Ipek often prompts me, what about the sound? What about the actual feeling of being in these places? And so I've definitely tried to gather this information through my archival research and through some existing oral histories. But again, as we've talked about kind of these gaps in the archive, the rioters or the people actually engaging in these acts, their words have been lost, or I have not been able to access them. But I have some records, mostly from the more formal civil rights organizing, of the sense of relief, the sense of calm after the kind of rupture in the environment. And in a way, my narrative of the riot and of the water coming after these fires and these explosions, I think there's also kind of this, this kind of sensorial, this joy of being in water. These narratives and these cases I'm looking at often involve children, so I imagine lots of laughter in these photographs I'm finding as well. So yeah, I think there's still a lot of information that can be that we can draw from these silent sources about these more effective environments. Yeah.
And we can draw them in the writing, maybe. A bit fabulating. Yeah.
I mean, that has been my kind of query, challenge, whatever you say, because it is a contemporary phenomena that I observed. So I could be part of that experience, because the architecture was not monumental. It was the socio-spatial practices which, led me. And they've, as you sort of said, it was this sensory experiences and the practices. Like when I walked into this apartment and these guys cooking mendo vada, just looking at that practice itself, 3 guys engaging, the oil going like hot, and the smells of this beautiful. I myself hadn't cooked or eaten that food in all the time that I've been in Germany. So it was so literally emotional, and that itself, produced this sense of solidarity, of coming together and being able to perform that because in Germany, given regulations, given the conditions, you have to be sort of very thoughtful of how you cook, what you cook, what's going out of your apartment, the smells, the oil sticking to the walls, all of these things, But then I'm thinking, how do I capture that, or how do I document it so it's not lost the richness of this, So yeah, it's kind of double-edged.
Thank you. I can see Amit popping up, so I guess we are out of time. Amit, is that the case?
Yeah.
No, I don't want to push you out, but yeah, I'm just sort of waiting to bring the event to a close.
Yes.
And I just want to take another few seconds to just sort of thank everybody who's been up in the middle of the night in the American side of things to join us here, and it's been great and fantastic sort of discussion as well. And I think we'll take a very, very short break, which is only quite enough for those who stick around, for them to sort of get up and sort of straighten their legs, maybe have a cup of tea, and we'll be back in exactly 10 minutes. I think we've had some fantastic conversations thinking about solidarity as a concept and how architecture sort of feeds into it. We're going to shift the discussion slightly geographically, I guess, a little bit more in the second session, looking closer to actions around the Indian Ocean rim, but also maybe I think in terms of scale, we've had a really sort of discussion around how solidarity is enacted at the level of the architectural scale, but we might be discussing a little bit more at a transnational scale. So there's going to be a few changes in that sort of second discussion. We'll hopefully bring other aspects of the concept of solidarity and how architecture can play a role in it. So for those of you who it's pretty late there, if you can stick around, that'll be great. But if you can't, we totally understand. And thank you for joining us. And yeah, in about 10 minutes, we will start with the second session. So thank you, everybody, for that first session. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Everybody.
Thank you.